and welcome everyone to the 9th in our monthly series of 12 webinars from Spring Lake, Blacksburg, Virginia, where we are apparently experiencing April showers today. So in today's webinar on composting regulations, our presenters will explain the general purpose of composting regulations, provide examples of rationale behind regulations, and describe some common violations. Our second speaker of the afternoon will be Gary Felton, who's a webinar series co-organizer and regular presenter from the University of Maryland. He'll address some general aspects of composting regulations and some specifics about Maryland regulations. But our first speaker today is a newbie to our webinar series. She is Catherine Persick from the she's a solid waste permit coordinator with the Office of Waste Programs with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. She's a lead staff person in the area of solid waste management permitting, including composting, and she has been a critical source of composting regulatory information for those of us in Virginia. So with that, Catherine, the webinar is yours.
Like Greg just mentioned, we're here for the regulations session. I'm Catherine Persick with Department of Environmental Quality. Just a note about who we are in Virginia. DEQ administers the state and federal laws and regulations for air quality, water supply, and land protection. And statewide, we are divided into 6 regional offices, which are shown in the different colors there. So a lot of our work ends up being, dispersed. So if you're dealing with permitting or compliance, you're dealing with people in the regions. Just to give you the highlights, we're going to go over some DEQ applicable regulations. And even though this focuses largely on Virginia, I think a lot of this is going to span to other states, as a lot of our programs we're enforcing federal regulations as far as water management, air, and waste. And so we'll touch on all those. And then specifically speak to solid waste siting design, operation, and closure criteria in Virginia for composting facilities. And then I have kind of like the old David Letterman style top 10 compliance violations that we note in Virginia. So applicable regulations, we have, there are multiple media programs that can apply to composting facilities, so stormwater, air, and then the composting activity itself. So let's dive in. So in Virginia, we have the VSWMR permit, the general Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. This is the permit that is associated with stormwater discharges from industrial activity. This is kind of the state extension of the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System program. So we issue general permits. There can also be individual ones, but for the most part, general permits for composting or also mulching activity. These permits are 5-year terms, and I'll give you some information about kind of who needs one of these. It's kind of based on the primary activity. So if you're composting, that is a regulated industrial activity covered under this program for Sector C. And then if you were just doing mulching activities, you're also under this program for Sector A. So as part of the VSWMR program, there's requirements for outfall monitoring. There's 4 general types of monitoring requirements that fall under the general permit umbrella. Only 3 of them apply to composting or mulching facilities. There's quarterly visual monitoring. So when you have a rain event, you have to go out and collect a sample and look at it. There's semi-annual benchmark monitoring, and depending on what industry you're in, your constituents you're looking for vary. So I've provided there what composting and mulching sampling criteria are in Virginia. There normally, if you had numeric effluent limitations, there'd be some compliance monitoring for that, but there's none identified in the Virginia General Permit Program. And then if your discharges go to impaired waters, there could be additional sampling, but that's going to be site specific. And then, as you do this monitoring, you then have to submit monitoring reports. So you can kind of expect similar, I think, in any state that if there's stormwater discharges, there's a program and there's monitoring and reporting. There's also a requirement to have a stormwater pollution prevention plan. And in this, you're going to identify who your pollution prevention team is at your facility. You'll have a site description with a site map. And in Virginia, that site map is very important because it kind of outlines where all the facility activity is, where your outfalls are, and kind of that's kind of what lays out what's covered under the general permit. You identify potential pollutant sources, what stormwater controls you have at the site, and then that's also the place where you're going to document your facility inspections and maintain your records. There's also a requirement to have an annual comprehensive site compliance evaluation by qualified personnel, and those would also be documented in your SWIP. That kind of covers the stormwater piece. Next up is sometimes there's questions about whether or not air permits might apply. And again, in Virginia, we have taken delegation of most of the federal air regulations. So, and then we also have state implemented regulations, but it seems like most activity for a composting or mulching operation would be exempt in Virginia. It's all based on the size of the equipment that's out there, and essentially it boils down to kind of the diesel engines that are operating at the site. And next up is the composting permit piece. And that's kind of the bulk of, I'm guessing, what you guys want to hear about. So this applies to the actual composting activity, so the acceptance of feedstocks, the processing, and then ultimately, getting your product sold. So there are two permit programs that this can fall under in Virginia. One is to have a water permit, and that's if you're composting solid waste that includes biosolids, so the sludge that comes from wastewater treatment plants. Or it's a solid waste permit. So if you don't include biosolids, then you're permitted under the land division. And so I provided the Virginia regulatory citations there. So basically the comparison here, permit-wise, for water, it's an individual permit. For solid waste, it's a permit by rule. So a little different of a permit procedure approach. Public comment and things are different as well. The fees are slightly different. One big one is the requirement for a waste management facility operator. That's something that's required in the solid waste world in Virginia, but is likely more unique to Virginia than other states. And then there's DEQ inspections and then financial assurance, and that's kind of cleanup for the for waste on site, kind of anticipated closure funds. And so why are there two different programs in Virginia? So this boils down to legislative authority in Virginia. So solid waste is covered under the Solid Waste Management Act, and then under the State Water Control Law is where biosolids comes in. But one kind of, and I don't know if this is unique to Virginia or not, but at least in Virginia, because the biosolids program a lot of time has to do with land application itself, they've kind of adopted, when it comes to composting biosolids, they've kind of adopted the solid waste requirement. So a lot of the other things I'm going to talk about, they're the same under each program, so it's really only the permit structure that's different. So we'll talk about the ones in Virginia, and again, a lot of this is going to, I think, it's going to vary slightly depending on what state you're in, but I think you're going to find similar things in other state programs. So in Virginia, we talk about two different kinds of composting facilities. Whether you're a type A facility, if you have a confined or enclosed vessel method of composting, or you're type B, if you're windrow or aerated static pile. And then we identify and have other requirements based on the type of feedstock you're going to take as a facility. And I think this is kind of the approach a lot of other states have taken, whereas depending on what the feedstock is and maybe what quantity of materials you're accepting, might put you into a slightly different category of composting facility, or you have different operational requirements. So in Virginia, we have category 1, that's pretty much all your pre-consumer vegetative-based material. Category 2 is animal-derived waste material, so that's like if you're processing dairy products or fish products, any of the waste from that could be composted as a category 2 feedstock. Animal and post-consumer food waste is category 3, so anything with pathogen potential. So that's where your animal manures are going to fall out, any of your post-consumer foods. And then category 4, is the catch-all for other waste there at the bottom. And so in Virginia, and I think in other states as well, you're going to find that there's going to be, I identified anything, if you were a compost facility type A or type B, accepting any of those feedstocks, typically you're going to fall under the realm of needing a permit in Virginia. However, we do have several exemptions, and I think you'll find exemptions in different states, and you're just going to have to read the fine print to kind of know whether your operation needs a permit. A lot of our composting exemptions come from if you're composting something that you generated at your own site. So a lot of this is geared towards household waste, or maybe restaurants that have that are tied to wanting to do kind of a compost bin in the back, composting of animal carcasses at the farm, a generation, things like that. We also have 2 at the bottom there composting for educational activities. We get interest in these from either universities that are going to try out a composting project, or having, we've had festivals come through where there's a big emphasis on the festival being green, and they'll compost all the waste generated from the weekend festival or something like that. And then also vermicomposting, that's also allowed. And so these two, I list there that the exemption is for 100 cubic yards. And all you have to do is, if you wanted to have one of these and you were going to have more than 100 cubic yards on site, you just have to seek DEQ approval, and we kind of walk you through the information we need in order to kind of give you an approval. We also have some exemptions for agricultural operations, or two of them are agricultural, but the idea of receiving yard waste from off-site, this could apply to landscaping companies or agricultural operations where they could receive either yard waste, or we also allow for herbivore manure to be received. There's just a registration requirement in lieu of the permitting I'll talk about in a little bit. But let's move on with some of the compost criteria. And again, I think this is where you're going to find similar things in different states. So in Virginia, for siting-wise, you have to have access to paved or surface roads. You can't be in an area subject to base floods. There's some different property buffers that you have to have. So this means that your composting activities, so your windrows, your areas where you're going to receive incoming feedstocks, all need to be, 100 foot from your property line, 50 feet to streams or wetlands, and 200 feet from residential area, healthcare facilities, schools, things like that. You have to have space on your property to minimize traffic congestion, and you have to have space to manage your run-on, run-off, and leachate. So next up is design and construction, and this is where we tie our requirements back to what type of category feedstock you're going to accept. So if you're accepting just vegetative waste, you have the least design and construction standards to comply with. You can pretty much just do that on the ground outside, but if you're going to be receiving any of those category 2, 3, or 4, so remember those are animal processing waste, things with pathogen potential with manures or post-consumer food, or MSW or other industrial waste streams that you were going to receive, then you'd have to have a covered handling area for receiving those wastes and sorting. There's additional requirements if you're within or near groundwater surface. And then if you're going to receive category 4 or do category 3 or 4 feedstock, 2 or 3 feedstocks in excess of 1,000 tons per quarter, then the area you're going to be receiving waste and doing your composting activity has to have a pad. And so that pad would either have to be an asphalt surface, a concrete surface, there's a lime stabilized surface option, or a geomembrane option with a gravel pad on top. So there's different options depending on the feedstock. And then you also have to have stormwater control features. Operations-wise, there's some generic operational controls, which this applies to pretty much all solid waste management facilities in Virginia, and it's probably similar across states. You got to pull out any of your non-compostable or undesirable material from the compost pile at the front end. You have to implement a safety program with fire prevention and suppression. You have to control dust and odors, vectors. Don't want mud on off-site surfaces. Perform self-inspections and maintenance of equipment. And then you can't discharge any waters from your operation without approval through a VSWMR program. In Virginia, you also have to have an operations manual. And we kind of put these operations manual on the facility. It's not something we review during the permit. It's more of something that it should, really spell out operations for a facility. And it consists of 5 plans. So basic operations plans, spelling out how you're going to manage feedstocks when they come in the door, and how you're going to compost them and turn them over. Includes details of your self-inspection plan, health and safety, unauthorized waste. So that's kind of outlining what you're going to do if waste comes to the gate that you weren't expecting, how you would handle that, and then emergency contingency planning. And in Virginia, like I said, this isn't part of the permit, so the facilities are essentially required to review these and recertify their operations manual on an annual basis. And you're certifying that your operations manual reflects your current operations and it meets the regulatory requirements in Virginia. There's record-keeping requirements, and I think every state's going to have these. We have them with respect to self-inspections and maintaining the required logs for self-inspections, as well as tracking waste volumes received and composted, and then that is ultimately reported annually as well. Keeping records of any unauthorized waste received and how it was ultimately disposed of or managed, and then sampling and monitoring records. Virginia also has a reporting requirement for any non-compliance or unusual condition that can endanger human health and the environment. This is kind of the catch-all reporting requirement in Virginia. It applies to all of our solid waste management facilities. But ideally, if something happens, oftentimes for compost facilities we're talking about if there's a fire or an incident, that it just gets reported to our compliance inspector so that we don't have to hear about it otherwise. And we can help also guide facilities in how to respond if they need that assistance. And so I mentioned on the record-keeping piece that there was sampling and analysis. You have to keep records of that. So in Virginia, there's finished compost testing requirements. It doesn't apply if you're only composting category 1, but if you're composting categories 2 through 4, then you'll have some testing requirements for that. The frequency of the analysis is based on the tons of finished compost produced per year. So the frequency can vary anywhere between once per month to once per year. Everyone has to do at least one stability test, and we provide 5 stability test options in the regulation there. If you're composting categories 3 and 4, you also have to do microbial testing, and you have microbial testing for parasites and bacteria or salmonella. And then if you're doing category 4, you also have to test for metals. And this is all supposed to coordinate with Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. They're the ones who govern the distribution of compost, the sale of fertilizer type material. And so these tests are, when we put them in the reg, we worked with them to get those requirements in our regulation. So if they met the compost requirements of our regulation, they'd know they met VDAC's requirements for selling their compost. Once you get to the end of life for a compost facility, the closure requirements in Virginia are to have a closure plan. You have 6 months to complete closure activities, although if you needed longer, you could ask for that too. But the goal would be to remove and decontaminate any waste that were on site, and hopefully there'd be no need for groundwater if you were able to remove everything, but that option is there should there be an issue with the site. So for solid waste, I don't have this full procedure for the biosolids one, but because that's water program and I'm in waste. But for solid waste, we have a permit by rule. You're basically just, it's an application where you provide the notice of intent, which is a cover letter describing your operation, and you pretty much provide all the information required. So disclosure statement, local government certification, certifications that you meet siting criteria, you have an operations manual, that you meet design and construction standards, you have a closure plan. So very basic things in Virginia, and basically if you check all the boxes, you'll be deemed to have a permit. In Virginia, we tried to make it simple by providing a nice application form that kind of allows you to check the boxes that you have all the information attached and to provide all the information up front that we need so that we are fully aware of the operation at your facility. And so once you have a permit in Virginia, you're subject to inspection by our inspection staff in the regions. That inspection usually entails an in-office file review, checking for reports that we've received since the last inspection. And then when you're on site, folks are doing a review of the records that you're maintaining, doing a site walk around and having interviews with personnel on site. And then it follows up with a written compliance inspection report that would identify any alleged violations if they were found during the inspection. That kind of brings us to the top 10 solid waste violations. So number 10 is the presence of a certified operator. The certified operator piece, I think I mentioned earlier, it may be unique to Virginia. There may be other states that have it as well, but this is a program that is run through our licensing board. And basically, folks are trained and then tested that they know the information in our solid waste regulations. And so we've had facilities have problems with maintaining certified operators, or especially with startups, maybe not having someone who's trained and licensed. So that one's kind of probably unique to Virginia. Another, number 9 is fires, and we're going from least common to most common here, like a traditional top 10, is fires. Having the fire isn't necessarily the violation because it's just a symptom of, it's the result of other issues. Typically, people have gotten violations for having fires because they failed to notify or failed to take action. Number 8 is having odor problems. Again, the presence of an odor usually means that there's other problems with the composting operation itself. I believe there were previous webinars on this topic as well. This example on the map here was, you can see the compost facilities highlighted in blue. There were some biosolid land application sites highlighted in red, and I believe there was property in the middle complaining about the odor, and I think it ended up being attributed to the biosolids and not the composting operation. But kind of a word to the wise for compost facilities, kind of know what's around you and kind of gauge the temperature maybe of the residents to see if they're going to mind. And then also operate so that you're not generating odors. Number 7 is a big one. Maintenance of buffer zones, off-site litter and dust, inadequate access controls. These are all kind of the generic operational conditions at the facility. So people failing to maintain, I think it was a 100-foot buffer zone from your property line, or having problems with blowing litter and dust, things like that. Number 6, compost piles exceeding permitted dimensions. With the permit application, it would spell out kind of how much material you can have on site and how big your compost piles can be, and people have exceeded those. The presence of material in your compost piles that shouldn't be there, and this is a particularly messy site. I believe there'd also been a lot of rain, which is why there's a lot of water there in the picture, but you can see a lot of plastic bags, material that should have kind of been screened out. We've had finished product testing issues. This can range from failing to test on the specified schedule from the regulation, or test failing the standards, but the facility maybe not doing anything about it. Remember, we're testing for compost stability, parasites and bacteria, and metals presence. Number 3 is failure to update or having inadequate financial assurance. I don't know if I explained financial assurance well the first time around, but basically you have to kind of provide a closure cost estimate for how much you think it would take to close your facility, so removing material, and you have to provide a financial assurance mechanism, so a trust fund, local government financial test, surety bond. There's several options, and those amounts are increased by inflation every year, and so there's a time schedule for doing that. So facilities failing to do that on the timely manner, or maybe having a increase in their operation and not updating as well for the increased cost. Stormwater issues are another big one. These are both, the first picture was the stormwater pond, kind of the pile itself kind of encroaching in the pond. And the next one, you can see all the dust kind of sitting on the surface of the pond there. Not always are those waste violations, but they could be water VSWMR violations. And then the biggest thing I think we see, and this might be generic across the board too, is just paperwork issues. There's a lot in the regulations that require you to maintain records. In Virginia, we have the additional operations manual requirement, and so updating the operations manual on an annual basis, not maintaining the records, being late on submittals, things like that. A lot of that can be a lot to kind of keep up with. And then I'll open it up if there's any questions that have come in.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that presentation, Catherine, and we'll allow a little bit of time for folks to get some questions in. They may be thinking about them even during our next speaker, so if you'll be around through the end of the webinar, any questions for you might come at a later time. So So far, I'm seeing none come in, but regulations are kind of an issue that people have a harder time sometimes wrapping their heads around, and particularly since we have differences among states.
Right, and so if you're in Virginia and you have other questions, I've provided some links, and I'll get the copy of this so that it can be distributed afterwards as well. But if you have Virginia-specific items, we have regulatory town hall, which is where you can find all our guidance, and then our website as well with links to regulations. We try to be very helpful and customer service friendly here in Virginia. We get a lot of questions typically like, am I an exempt operation or do I need a permit? And walking that line can be confusing, and I'm sure that's true in any state, trying to figure out whether you need a permit or not, and then if you do need a permit, complying with that permit and the requirements.
So Catherine, we have one of our registrants is going to test you. They apparently missed what number 7 of the top 10 violations is. So I either maybe scroll back, or if you recall what that one was.
7 was, it's mainly like a generic catch-all for operations. So it was maintaining your buffer zones. So the piles getting too large or shifting into your buffer zones. In Virginia, it's a 100-foot requirement for your activity, from your activity to your property boundary. Also having off-site litter and dust issues and inadequate access control. So that could be that there's, because the size of the operation's gotten so big, it's taken over where trucks normally would be, or not having gates and things kept in good maintenance. So those are the generic number 7.
Okay, so we have another question that's associated with the U.S. Composting Council Seal of Testing Assurance Program. So I'm not, I suspect that you have some knowledge of that. And the question is asked, it says, does that meet your test requirements? I think what they mean is if you meet U.S. Compost Council Seal of Testing Assurance, will that typically meet your material reporting requirements?
That's not an area I'm familiar with, actually. We don't have that many compost facilities in Virginia, so we don't always get that many questions. I'm not familiar with the program. Well, I guess I know a bit of the program, but not exactly how it impacts with our testing requirements in Virginia.
Yeah, so if I might be able to clarify a little bit in that the U.S. Compost Council Seal of Testing Assurance is more of a program to ensure that your compost is sampled correctly and analyzed, and then there is an analysis that's provided typically from a certified lab. But because compost has various uses, for many of the parameters, there are not requirements through the STA, but the requirement is largely that you just have your material tested. Of course, there are, we know scientifically, levels of pathogens that should be reduced in metals according to the EPA, but for the STA, it doesn't require standards be met per se as the testing be done. Let's see, we have another question. Oh, and apparently it was asked and answered.
Okay.
Okay, it looks like there are a few more that are coming up. So is there a place where you can get a list of all currently permitted composting facilities in Virginia? That is both facilities that have a permit by rule and traditional permits. I'm guessing they mean full permits.
Right, so we have, I believe, one full permitted one, and that's just, it was permitted prior to them having the permit by rule option. Yeah, so you can just send me an email and I can send you the list from our database. That's the easiest way to get it.
Okay, so the questions seem to have slowed down. And so I think maybe we could take this opportunity to move on to our next speaker, and then maybe at the end have more time for both speakers to answer questions. So again, as I mentioned earlier, our second speaker today is Gary Felton from the University of Maryland. And Gary, the webinar is now in your hands.
I'm going to try to do something about that. Are you seeing something useful there, Greg? I'm going to talk today about some things that are a little bit 10,000 foot view rather than looking down at too much detail. A couple of times I'll talk about Maryland details, but for the most part, I'm going to talk about general regulation. I'm also going to look a little bit about some of the things that may actually be in regulations, but people don't remember to talk about them. This presentation was stolen without any shame at all from the U.S. Composting Council and from the Better Composting School presentations on regs. In general, they vary from state to state. It's very regulated, and frankly, it's going to get more regulated. There's permitting issues, there's compliance, and both of them can lead to cost. We have two general areas, the compost manufacturing process compared to compost the product. Those two can be regulated even separate agencies because in Maryland, the process is regulated by the Maryland Department of Environment, MDE. Compost the product is treated like a fertilizer, it's regulated by MDA. It's getting worse and worse every year. So where can you find a contact for regulations in your state? I was so glad that Catherine kind of gave that information there. That information can be found at the U.S. Composting Council's website. This is the link to it, and it's basically a map. Somewhere on the USCC site is also a map of all the compost sites that they're aware of. So if you're looking for compost sites in your state, you might be able to find them on that map. My guess is they're not going to be there. So there's lots of regulations you might need to know that I'm not going to talk about at all. There are state environmental protection issues, and that list looks just like what Catherine had. There's waste, water, and air in general. There's occupational safety, both federal and state OSHA types of things. State regulates the product. Local is usually limited to zoning, but that zoning can be so confining that you can't open a site in some places. For instance, some zoning may require that you have a 500-foot setback from all property lines. Take 500 feet out of the property all the way around and you may not have any property left. There are construction and occupancy limits, some health issues. Each county has a health department and they have some flexibility in regulations. And then there's solid waste management that may be local. So when we talk about the process versus the product, in general, the process might be land use. It might be using or managing waste. The product is the compost, the fertilizer. It might contain heavy metals, pathogens, inert objects, things like that. If you look, you can usually find something called FSMA, Food Security not maintenance, but it's updating, Management Act. And that'll have to do with where your compost can be used. I'm going to talk about the USCC Model Compost Rule Template because that's where Maryland started writing its regulations, and that's where a lot of people start, and then they involve the state regulators, and the state regulators go in and see the things that may not fit within their charge and their regulation. So the model has these components to it: definitions, feedstock categories, exemptions. 3 tiers are based on the feedstock categories and criteria for siting and testing requirements. And that probably sounds pretty much like what Catherine said. Somewhere in here, I'll use the abbreviation MCRT. It refers to the Model Compost Rule Template. Maryland has something called general restrictions. I suspect that everybody does, but nothing, not just a compost facility, but nothing that you put in a place can create a nuisance. It can't be conducive to insect and rodent infestation, can't cause nuisance odors, and so on down this list. Those are called general restrictions, and if you have a compost facility that is getting a problem of some sort, this may be one of the ways that you can end up getting shut down just by general restrictions. This usually starts the regulations way at the front and people forget about it because it's not real specific to the compost site itself. If you look at feedstock, that's what you're bringing in. Catherine had types. We have type 1, 2, and 3 in general, and that's yard trimmings, woody materials, stuff that doesn't have much of a potential to create problems. Type 2 is agricultural residuals, source separate organics, food processing, other byproducts from industry. That would include animal manures in it. Type 3 is something along with MSW, municipal solid waste, which for some reason the Compost Council called mixed solid waste, sludge, biosolids, and other stuff like that. Typically, type 3 requires all kinds of additional regulations, probably going to have to do with the federal 503B regulations for handling sludge and biosolids. The 3 tiers in Maryland have process type 1 feedstocks only, process type 1 and 2 feedstocks in tier 2. In Maryland, we have sub-tiers for the size, and they're just called large and small. And we have process type 1, 2, and 3 in tier 3 feedstocks. So one of the things that we got in Maryland is that tier 2 large and tier 2 small have different pad requirements, more rigid pad requirements for tier 2. So anytime you see these white slides, this is Maryland specific. I can let you read all of this. It's just the specifics of what we've done with pads. Any tier has to meet PFRP. We've talked about PFRP in earlier seminars. That's the time, the temperature requirements to kill pathogens, to kill seeds. And of course, we don't claim 100% kill, but it does a good job of reducing. We call it process for further reduction of pathogens, so we don't claim 100%. There are 2 types of requirements. They're performance-based or they're prescriptive. Prescriptive is something you have to do. Performance-based is how something turns out. We'll see some of those in the examples here in a few minutes. The feedstock categories, I think I've been over those. Why is that in there again? There are exemptions, as Catherine said. Typically, the backyard is exempted. On-farm with no distribution is typically exempted. On-farm animal mortality is typically exempted. And low throughput things are typically exempted from having to deal with too much in the regulations. You may have to register your compost facility, but you don't have to have a lot of regulation on it if you meet some of these exemptions. There are design and operating standards typically in all tiers. That's the prescriptive versus the descriptive performance, where a site operating plan has to be completed, has to be available for review. That's something you have to do, but it doesn't have a criteria for how something turns out. You define the intent and allow operators to define how they're going to meet that intent. An example is a composting area should have run-on and run-off controls and a slope of some X%. Again, PFRP carries through all tiers. Differentiating requirements in tiers 2 and 3. The pad or the protective surface requirements is one of them that I've showed you. It may have to do with feedstock management. For example, in Virginia, you had to bring your feedstocks under roof if you had certain tiers, as we call them. If you have contact water management, it may have to be more rigorous in tiers 2 and 3. Stormwater management is probably more rigorous. And the maximum windrow and size and spacing may be prescriptive. Maryland doesn't have it prescriptive, but some places do. All-weather pad. An all-weather pad in Maryland is pads designed, constructed, and maintained to keep water from being on the surface. That means to prevent ponding, transport water, get rid of contamination. The all-weather pads have to meet these following criteria. You have to be away from groundwater. Some places in Maryland it's 2 feet. Mostly it's 5 feet. It varies with tier. The soil type may be prescribed, and some are called low or impermeable surfaces. And in some cases, the permeability is specified, such as 10 to the minus 6 centimeters per second of infiltration rate, which is typically what's done for a landfill cover, I'm sorry. This is where you find regulations for Maryland. COMAR is the Code of Maryland Regulations, and you can find the Department of Agriculture in 15.18.4, and that's for compost the product. COMAR 26.04.11 is the Department of the Environment subtitle Regulations of Water, Sewage, and Solid Waste, Chapter 11, and this is for the facilities. I've put the website down there if you just really have an interest in going to read regulations. There are different types of permits in the general model permit. There's a full permit, and that allows everything to be processed. There's registration or lesson permits. Some of our sites in Maryland, you simply go onto a website, fill in a web form, and you've registered. And that makes it all you have to do, and MDE knows where you are and what you've got. MDE will review the registration, and if they think you need to do a more rigorous permit, they will contact you. There is also permit by rule, where it's automatically within a specific set of conditions given a permit, but it may still require registration and approval of that registration. Factors that affect which permit include the activity going on, that is, how is the composting and all the equipment being used, what are the feedstocks coming in, some location issues. The Eastern Shore of Maryland is very sensitive to high groundwater table, and that may be a location. And then the size. We have a 40,000 square foot trigger that changes the size in Maryland. It will include siting criteria and setbacks, may include financial assurance, in other words, bond, or some other financial insurance, so that you can, there's a way to close the site if that's a problem. The components I'm going to go over generally. The components are construction and site preparation, operational requirements, record keeping, and the quality of the product. And those are things that you're going to test for, so that'll be where the testing comes in. There are other environmental protection permits, which are erosion and sediment control during construction, stormwater pollution prevention plan, sampling and testing criteria. The air protection in Maryland, if you have a large horsepower, I believe the number is 450 horsepower machine for anything, you're going to have an air permit for that. And there are others where odor is a nuisance. We have zoning and local land use issues. In Maryland, we had a zoning issue where several people in the county really wanted to zone out any possible compost facilities. So some of the localized zoning can pretty much regulate you out of business. Not often is it done where you can't be grandfathered in, but it happens. One thing that's important is that the fire marshal may have a say over whether you get a permit or not. In Maryland, the fire marshal reviews permits, sends them back to the MDE, the regulatory office, with comments. There's no formal statement that says that the fire marshal can cancel you, but I think if the fire marshal has an issue, MDE is going to hesitate to grant you a permit. There's solid waste management, which can be district, county, agency, authority, or something. And you may need to approve or include that in your plan. Product-related regulations. That's in agriculture, that could be consumer protection, either one. depends on what you're claiming about your compost. Is it a fertilizer? Does it have a specific nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium content? Or are you claiming it's a soil amendment or a soil conditioner where you're not claiming any nutrient content? Fertilizer generally includes any guaranteed analysis. And in Maryland, you have to have a guaranteed max or minimum analysis, but also a guaranteed maximum is important because some things are claiming to be soil amendments and they're claiming percentages of N such as 0.05%. But it ends up they have about 1.5% nitrogen, and then Maryland kind of takes a dim view of having that much nitrogen in without talking about it on the label. The facility license is different from the product registration, and the facility license in Maryland is a separate organization, MDE. There's approval for use on organic farms. That would be completely separate from any of our agencies. It would be an OMRI approval to be classified as an organic compost. One of our poultry processors, Purdue Farms, has a composting site in Delaware, and they have approved organic compost as part of their operation. There's a lot to doing that, and I'm not going to cover it, but there's an awful lot of it. And how is the compost going to be used around fresh foods? And that's covered by FSMA, Food Security Modernization Act at USDA. So that's a federal approval. I think this is going to sound an awful lot like the things that Catherine had, maybe not the same order. But what are some of the regulatory challenges at compost facilities? And odor seems to be up at the top of the list quite often. If you're not familiar with the term NOV, that's a notice of violation. That was on the cover slide, and that usually gets accompanied by fines. We have odor issues as the top one, stormwater violations. Truck traffic is often a complaint. Sometimes it's something that the operation itself has failed to manage well. Sometimes it's something that really doesn't have anything to do with the operation. Fire is always a complaint, but it's what caused the fire that's of more interest in regulatory circles. Dust is often a complaint. You really need a dust management plan for your part of your facility's operation plan. Record keeping and land use compatibility. That's a real generic term, but sometimes where you have a compost facility and suddenly a development of 200 homes pops up in the adjacent property, there will probably be some conflict occur at some point in time. Yeah, the compost facility was there first, but there will be people over there in the new housing that don't see it that way. And so conflict is probably guaranteed in that case. This is a picture of getting inspected. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens when you get inspected. Inspectors show up, obviously. But when you're going to get inspected, and even if you don't know what for, be prepared. Make sure that you know where all of your paperwork is and don't have to go looking for it. You really do know what they're going to look for. They're going to look for the records that are a requirement. They're going to look at some minimum standards. If you have a specific permit, they'll look at the permit conditions. If you have a general permit, there are certain conditions for all permits that they will probably look at. They're going to try to make sure that you're not exceeding your site volume limits. And they will be doing that with probably an estimate. So one of the things you probably need to know at some point in time is, how do I look at a windrow and estimate how much the volume is in it? That may be in one of our seminars later. And they'll be looking for, how did you respond to complaints? So if you've had a complaint, it's more likely that you'll be inspected. And how did you respond to that complaint really needs to be documented and kept in your set of records. Usually we have what's called a compost operator's plan book, and that's a good place to keep your complaint response. When you're working with regulators, be straightforward and honest with them. They ask you a question, be just as clear as you can be about answering it. Listen closely. Be sure you understand what they're asking before you answer. Ask as many questions as are pertinent. Make sure that you and they are always on the same page. Look at the requirements and the expectations on your permit. Look at the requirements and expectations that they may set forth when they come on site. Ask them about other facilities similar to yours. Learn about where there's other facilities that are doing similar things. You can get your heads together and figure out the things that are best for permitting and things that you may be able to learn from them or teach them from your operation. Discuss requirements that are unduly onerous and propose reasonable alternatives. Don't look for, we just don't want you to inspect. That's pretty much not going to be considered reasonable. But if you can come up with an answer, regulators may be quite willing to work with you to figure out, okay, we can get the same goal that we were looking for done a different way. They'll work with you on that. Be personable, cooperative, polite. It's hard for me to do, but I try to do that. Pay attention to the rules and don't be late to a meeting. Don't keep them waiting. Make sure you get who they were. Write their names down, the dates, get their titles. Usually they'll come in with a set of cards, and they'll give you a card so you can get it all down in a card and you don't really have to write it down. But transfer that card to your operator plan. Keep it in the plan book. Request decisions and opinions in writing. That way you can go back and your memory won't be the thing that you have to depend on. And really work on keeping records. If you have a permit that has a volume, don't push it above that volume. Don't push your permit even really terribly close to that volume. Make sure you handle small problems. If you have a problem that is clearly something in violation of the permit, call the permitters in, tell them you've identified this, and here's what we're doing about it. The problems will escalate if you don't do something like that. It's your responsibility to know what the permits, the rules, and the regulations are that apply to your site. You've got to know everything that you're responsible for doing before they show up. Get started early on that. Plan for future growth. As we've said on other seminars, I don't know any composter that said, well, gee, I just have too much space on this site. So try to make sure that you include growth when you're setting up your site originally and plan for that growth. Cultivate your partners, other guys that are working in the industry. They don't have to be in your state, but keep some friends in your state so they can have common problems. And if you go to this website I've showed you, you can find your state regulation and key contacts there. And that's all I've got to cover regulations in general. I didn't talk much about specific regulations for Maryland. Don't really want to talk about the specific regulations because they won't help you since everyone's from everywhere else. Greg, at this time, do you want to play with some questions?
Sure. So far we haven't had any new questions. Somebody did offer the FSMA is the Food Safety Modernization Act.
Not
which
security,
is, yeah, which is right. pretty close. But other than that, we still have some time for both Catherine and Gary to answer any questions if there are any others. And I'm wondering why at this point, maybe we could have Mark Locklear post the URL to our Qualtrics survey, which again, I would ask anyone who's participated in any of our webinars to please fill out. It is actually quite helpful to us. So I'm thinking, I know it's not people have been bored to death by regulations because these have been two of the more interesting presentations and informative presentations on regulations that I could hear. So what I would say is to everyone, thanks though for your participation today. As usual, we try to have the recording of this webinar posted within a week. And I'll, to those who are registered, I'll send an email with that link to you. And as always, feel free to contact the speakers directly. If there's questions afterwards that, that you have, certainly share those questions with them. Next month, well, so up to now, the first 9 seminars have focused more on composting itself. The regulations covered a little bit of the final product, but largely they dealt with the composting operation. Starting the next webinar, and for the next 3, the webinars will deal more with the final product. Next month is on compost quality and standards, and you'll get an email about that. I hope you'll join us. And then there'll be one on compost use, and finally marketing. Let's see, looks like there's, do we have another question? Okay, so someone asks, did I understand correctly that pad restrictions in Virginia, including it must include curing. In Maryland, the pad restrictions such as asphalt are for active composting only. So Catherine, Catherine, could you, are the pad restrictions in Virginia, are they also for curing of the product?
Yeah, I was going to go see if I could make sure I answer this correctly by quick checking the reg. I do think they do extend, because I think we've had questions about that the curing area would also have a pad, but not if you were doing category 1 only. But let me just confirm that I'm not speaking out of turn.
As you're looking that up, usually I think of the cured product as one that no longer has pathogen issues or some of the other concerns of the uncured product, but
right. Well, and we've gotten that question before. Under the reg, it says if you're doing more than 1,000 tons per quarter of category 2 or 3, or you're doing category 4, receiving, mixing, composting, curing, screening, and storing operations should have the pad underneath it. So the asphalt or concrete, the lime stabilized area, or a gravel pad with a geomembrane. So, I mean, if you had an operation in Virginia and you wanted to talk further about maybe that not being appropriate, we're always open to talking about those things. But that is what's in the reg.
All right. And as Gary has said, and as I've learned in dealing with the regulators in Virginia, it has been mostly a good interaction. They like to work with the industry to ensure that the industry succeeds and not necessarily trying to put the industry out of business. So again, it looks like there may be no more questions at this point, but each of you may get a few emails. So again, I'd like to thank both of you for presenting, and Mark Locklear for again running a great show. And we'll see you hopefully in a month.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.